Hello and welcome to the When Words Collide podcast. I am one of your hosts, Eli Smart. My pronouns are he, they.
And I am Lucas Diano. My pronouns are he, him, and I am your other host for the When Words Collide podcast. And today we are here with the wonderful Premee Mohamed.
Hi, folks. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Thank you for coming. We're very happy to have you.
So tell us a bit about yourself, kind of your writing and what drew you to this conference.
Well, this was a funny one because I actually accepted, I think, last year and then immediately forgot about it. So it wasn't until I saw my own face on a poster scrolling by on social media that I kind of panicked and was like, oh, I'm supposed to be going to this. So the first thing I need to tell you about myself is that it's been a very, very busy year.
Fair.
Yeah, I'm a scientist. My degrees were in molecular genetics and environmental science. And up until last year, I'd spent about 22 years working in the field of science, mostly environmental science, and writing on the side. And this year, I'm actually the writer in residence at the Edmonton Public Library, the Milner location downtown, which has been fantastic. I write short fiction, I write novellas, I write novels, and that's mostly in the fields of science fiction, fantasy, horror, and I'm going to go ahead and say mashups of all of the above. And I've always been drawn to speculative fiction and kind of the literature of the imagination, because I think that lets us explore ideas that we can't really in a way with contemporary realism, because we have to account for all the baggage that the reader is bringing. I think speculative fiction gives us more control over the worlds that we're creating and the ideas and philosophies that we'd like to express.
Awesome. Well, and kind of on that note about speculative fiction, at When Words Collide, you have a couple of panels happening where you're going to be talking about fantasy, science fiction, and crafting those kinds of worlds. And well, I know for one, I'm very excited because I love those genres. And when it comes to those genres, it can be a bit daunting trying to write some of that on your own, because there's a whole lot to take into consideration, more than just writing a story that takes place in the real world or is grounded in realism. And so when it comes when it comes to you trying to write those types of genres, I know this might be a bit of a loaded question, but what is your initial process when it comes to coming up with new worlds, or getting into those cracks and crevices of these different genres, because they can all vary in terms of realism.
That is a super good question. And the answer, as with so much else in writing, I think, is it depends. So I've certainly had books that were secondary world, which generally just means, not the world that we live in. It's a made up world, where I've kind of done the world building on the fly. So I'll start with my idea for the book, and if I think there's something interesting, I will just throw it right in there. And that may be something visual, that may be something cultural, that may be a food, that may be the name of a town, anything. I will just make it up and put it in for my own amusement, and then wait to see if my editor tells me to take it out. For other books, though, the one I'm particularly thinking of is my March novel that came out this year, The Siege of Burning Grass. That actually has been in the works for a really long time, and I've spent probably about 10 years reading about, military movements and warfare and the effects of combat and conflict on the landscape and on civilians and on trauma, sort of collective trauma, as well as literal things like the effects on the landscape, effects on agriculture. And it wasn't until, a couple of years ago that I had the idea for the book and realized that a lot of what I needed to create that world, I had already read about. So that was more a deliberate process of translating real world items. For example, there were points during World War II when, for example, children were being evacuated in France and surrounding countries from the urban areas to the countryside, and they were given little numbered badges to pin to their clothing, and some of them were painted with phosphorescent paint, so they would glow in the dark. So in theory, you couldn't lose track of them if you were in a blackout situation. And for my book, for example, I decided that was such an interesting idea, and I converted that to fit with the world of the book, which was kind of these genetically modified and biomechanical creatures being used by one side. So instead of a badge, it's a bioluminescent beetle. And the beetle kind of stays with the child. And therefore, you can not only see them in the dark, but the child is not alone. They've got a little companion with them. So there were a lot of things where I thought the real world equivalent of this is interesting, but I want to make it fit and be consistent with the rest of the storytelling. And a big theme in this story is that living things have to consent to being used as tools. So the main character does under duress, but what about all the other living things that they have pressed into service for the war that never got a chance to say yes or no? That's something I would like readers to think about.
That's fascinating.
No, honestly, and it's really cool to be able that you're taking these real world elements and thinking about how they work thematically as well as the technology and the politics of your world. It all, because of course, like you're using it to say something and being able to use all these little elements to really share the message and tell the story you want to tell is fantastic.
Yeah,
thank
because
you.
you know, at the end of the day, these genres are in a way a reflection of the real world, no matter how unrealistic they may seem. And you know, I guess in a way that allegorical aspect is how genres like fantasy have managed to stay relevant well into the current day. And part of that reflecting the real world in that sense, that along with that comes how times change and how our interpretations of different aspects of these genres change. And on that note, Premee, one of your panels at When Words Collide is tackling cultural appropriation in writing, especially when it comes to the genres we've talked about, fantasy and science fiction, because in those worlds where humanity is not the only species, or at least the species on our level, that leaves room for new species to come in, and that means a writer has to think about what they want for that species, and along with that comes many complications, and among them is that new species being a bit too close in relation to a group of peoples that actually do exist. And so you're going to tackle it at that panel, but what do you think is one thing that people should always keep in mind when it comes to tackling different species and races in their stories?
That is another good question. And I think it's something that a lot of writers don't really think about. I've heard from friends, oh, it's like I can't write anything now. I'm white, so I can't write a black character. Or, oh, I'm a man, so I can't write a woman. I think people are looking at things a little bit too simplistically. I think the important thing to keep in mind when you're writing about groups that are not like yourself is nuance and respect. If we're going to be representing a group, any type of community or classification or category that we don't belong to, it's not going to be either a good piece of art or a respectful or authentic piece of art if you don't do your research. So these are cases where I would always recommend that writers especially not attempt to write from the viewpoint of a demographic that or a culture that they don't belong to, unless they get a lot of sensitivity or accuracy reading done, but also to do things like speak to the people that are going to be affected by your work. Talk to people that belong to that culture or to that ethnicity or to that background or to that region. There will be things that people won't even think about. There will be cultural nuances, there will be taboos, there will be areas of sensitivity, just as we have. And just because a group is different from us doesn't mean that those don't exist. I'm even thinking of things like working with the the disability community or the chronic pain community. It behooves us as writers to create the worlds that we want, but without perpetuating and reinforcing negative stereotypes about real people that's going to have real effects in the real world. And I think that's something that some writers don't want to hear. They want to just hear that, oh, they can make anything up. It's fictional. Just make it up. Our books are going to be read by people that are not in our community. They're going to be read by people that are not in our demographic. How do we want those readers to feel when they see themselves represented on the page? So I think that would be my main piece of advice for writers that are struggling with how to represent even fictional cultures on the page. What are you stealing? Are you taking things for the aesthetic? Are you, are you coming up with things? Are you recombining things in a way that doesn't affect real people? Are you doing it in a way that's not harmful?
I know of course, that's a really good point as well, because at least for me, I know you'll always hear the saying, write what you know. And for me, it's write what you know. And if you don't know about it, learn it, right? There are so many different resources, especially nowadays with access to the internet. There are so many talks that people have already had that are out there for you to see. So why not, especially if you're, at least for me, if you're writing anything, taking the time to think about what the effects are and why you're putting things in there is just really important. And at the same time, while you're doing that, why not think about, like you said, the background of things, like where does this thing you're adding or putting into your story come from? And then just being able to really dive deep into it will not only help your story, but like you said, there can be real world consequences to the things you put in a story. So just be able to, yeah, take the
Yeah.
time to learn about it.
Yeah, anecdotally too. I was actually talking to a friend of mine a couple of days ago, and he said he was very, very grateful to have worked with an accuracy reader for a script that he's working on, which involves the colonization. So it's sci-fi, the colonization of a far-off planet by a primarily Japanese spaceship. It turns out that this spaceship was mostly Japanese scientists and astronauts, and he gave this planet a specific name, which I'm not going to go into detail here. And his accuracy reader, who is of Japanese descent, pulled him aside and was like, you do not know the historical ramifications of that name. That is a very politically and historically loaded right-wing term for something in Japan from the 1950s that you would have had no way of knowing about, and you obviously didn't look it up. So she helped him come up with a new name for the planet, and they took out entirely the old name from the script. And I thought, what a good example of working with someone who's actually got the context to know what you are trying to do.
100%.
Yeah, absolutely. It's important to, always, like Eli already kind of touched on this, but what you don't know shouldn't be out of reach. If you don't know something, you should always make an effort to find out, because there's nothing bad about learning. There's nothing bad about expanding your wealth of knowledge, and especially when it comes to writing, that can really benefit the final product.
And speaking of, like you were talking about, nuances and looking at things from the perspective of really diving deep into it and learning about it, when it comes to things like short stories, and of course, I believe you have a panel on it already. So of course, you specialize in short fiction. You're able to, that's really something that you jive with. When it comes to short stories, what would you say the nuances of those are, and how do they differ from something more long form?
Oh, how long have you got? So the session that I'm doing for When Words Collide is a really big deep dive. That one's just not a panel, that's a class. Oh, also, this is my chance to shout myself out, because literally yesterday I won an Aurora Award for a short story that was published last year. So that was
Congrats.
very,
Oh my
thank you.
gosh.
That was very exciting. And, I've always found the short form actually extremely difficult. I'm not one of those people who writes naturally at the shorter length. And I was always very envious of those authors who either were extremely good at it or primarily stuck to the short length, because people tend to think incorrectly, I would say, that you start with short stories and then you quote, work your way up, unquote, to long form work. And I don't think that's the case. I think it's two different sets of skills. It's really apples and oranges. What you're trying to do in a short story is not write a miniaturized novel. You're trying to do kind of what Edgar Allan Poe referred to as create a unity of impression. So a handful of pivotal moments for a very small number of characters over generally a short period of time. And the short story is all about impact. It's all about leaving the reader with one specific memory or impression or question in their head at the end of the single sitting that it takes to read a short story, which is a very, very difficult skill. Some people kind of come at short stories more as they would come at an essay, I think. You know, they think it has to be shaped a certain way, it has to go a certain way, it has to have a certain format, and you can't really stray out of that. The best thing about short stories for me is that you can experiment so much with the format and the structure and things like the language and the timeline. And there is a really remarkable, I would say, advantage to writing short fiction that experiments that way, because let's all face it, there are a lot of gimmicks that wear really, really thin at the novel length, but they're okay at like 3,000 words. It's kind of like eating a tiny sliver of a really, really rich dessert. So I think what I'm going to be emphasizing when I talk about it at When Worlds Collide is think about the impression you want your story to make, because you don't have a lot of space to make it in. Everything has to be very efficient. Everything has to be very effective. And there can't be any fluff or filler or tangents or divagations. You have to stay on task the whole time. And I find that immensely difficult. A lot of the, I would say, only short stories that I consider of mine that are any good ended up at the much, much longer length, like 6,000, 7,000 words.
Wow.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm sure a lot of people can relate to the point you made about certain ideas and stories not really working at a full novel length, but you know, you can explore it sometimes greater in a shorter story. I know there have been times when I have an idea and I think it's a good one, and then I get to writing it, and then I realize, oh, after a while, you know, I'm stretching it a little. It's kind of stretched beyond, you know, what I was trying to do before, but at a shorter length, you know, it becomes much more effective. So I definitely think that's something a lot of people could learn from, and I think a lot of people underestimate power of short stories because, you know, just from a very neutral standpoint, a book seems like, you know, a richer source of writing to go for. But you know, when you actually take a step back and look at it, you know, short stories, there's a whole another like arena of storytelling that you could either fiction or nonfiction, whatever you want in those types of stories. So yeah, I definitely think the power of the short story is something that should be explored and will be explored.
No, 100%. And so, speaking of short stories and stories that you yourself have written, haha, good segue. Where would we be able to find some of your work for us and for the audience listening to really be able to dive deep into what you do?
Well, there's my short story collection, which won the Writers Guild of Alberta Award earlier this year and has been up for the British Fantasy Awards, the Locus Awards, lost an Aurora Award last night, but is now up for a World Fantasy Award, which I also found out about last night. That one's called No One Will Come Back for Us, and it's published by Undertow Publications, and it's also out in audio for people who enjoy the audio experience of short stories. The narrator did a wonderful job. Secondary to that, though, a lot of my stuff has been published online and is available for free. So if people go to my website, which is premeemohamed.com, you'll be able to find links to quite a few of my stories. I should warn you in advance, those all used to be organized really nicely, but recently had a website revamp, and in changing the design of the short fiction page, all the dates got jumbled up. So the links in theory should work. but they're no longer arranged chronologically. But quite a few stories of mine are available online. And actually, I'm going to shout out a recent one, which was published in Strange Horizons last month, called By Salt, by Sea, by Light of Stars, which is about a wizard and an apprentice, and surprisingly, a sea monster.
Oh, nice. Those are a good yeah, 100% good, some good combinations. Yeah, and our last question of this interview is just a simple one. Do you have any pieces of advice for anyone trying to break into writing in the writing industry?
Yeah, my biggest piece of advice would be to read really, really broadly as well as deeply in your genre or your subgenre. The main reason for that is not just so that you can read analytically and see what you like and don't like about other people's writing so that you can use it in your own writing, but also because that's the best way to see what is being acquired and published right now. And if you're not up on current trends in your genre, whatever that is, the likelihood of your stuff being published is a lot lower because you have to connect to an editor in order to have your work seen in the world. So read, 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 read more than that, and stay current.
Well, thank you very much for being with us. And you are going to be having a couple different events at When Words Collide. And you can find and to our viewers and listeners, you can find all of these events on the When Words Collide website across the entire weekend. There's going to be a keynote event at 7 p.m. on Friday the 16th, which will kind of kick off the event properly in a way, a bunch of different people at the event. And then after that, at 11 a.m., there's going to be Technically Correct, getting the technical aspects of fiction right, which we actually touched on earlier in this interview. There's going to be an Ask Us Anything panel at 1 p.m. on the 17th as well, so you can get up close and personal with some of your favorite writers in attendance. And also touched on earlier, there's going to be Navigating Cultural Appropriation, Ethical Considerations for Writers at 2 p.m. on Saturday, August 17th. There's going to be an autograph session at 4 p.m., also on the 17th. And on Sunday, the 18th at 11 a.m., there's going to be The Soul of Short Fiction, which I am very excited for, and which we also touched on earlier. That's going to be a very nice panel.
I am super excited.
No, well, thank you so much for coming on to the show and talking to us about your experience and sharing your story with us.
Thank you very much.
We're very excited to be able to see your work not only at When Words Collide, but as well as in general going forward. So, and thank you to all who are listening now, and I hope to see you all at the event.
Thank you guys so much.
Of course.
Thank you so much.